What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets.
Metroidvanias are a genre I've avoided based solely on the stupid name alone. However, after diving headfirst into the shitshow dumpster of a genre that is roguelikes, lights, light-likes, and light-brights, I don't really have any excuse anymore. See, my problem with Metroidvanias is that there's not a whole lot of literature on them, and that the actual definition of it is vague at best and non-existent at worst. Though I think there's enough floating around at this point to start codifying something that resembles an actual definition, at least for this video. Since I'm no better than any of the other subhumans that actually care about video game genres, let's get really into the nitty-gritty of it, or better put, and a better YouTube title, let's look at a brief history of Metroidvanias. It turns out, Metroidvanias originate from neither Metroid nor Castlevania. To explain that, we need to talk about our definition first. From here on, when I refer to a Metroidvania, I'm referring exclusively to non-linear side-scrolling platformers, with an emphasis on utility-based exploration and backtracking. Using that definition, there are a couple of Metroidvanias that predate the arrival of Metroid in 1986. I'll call these Protovanias for the sake of clarity. The first Protovania I'll be talking about is Montezuma's Revenge, featuring Panama Joe! It was released in 1985 on a variety of systems: the Atari 2600, 5200, 8-bit, Apple II, Commodore 64, and the ColecoVision. It was also later re-released on the Sega Master System in 1988. It was developed by Robert Yeager at the age of 16 and published by Parker Brothers.
The Shadow Lord!
Yeah, that Parker Brothers. Montezuma's Revenge was a side-scrolling adventure game where the hero Panama Joe explored a pyramid consisting of 9 floors, which sounds familiar to me. As you may have guessed, Montezuma's Revenge is going to be the least similar to contemporary Metroidvanias in this list. However, it still featured some mechanics that would become staples of the genre in just a couple years, namely items that were required for progression. Unlike upgrades found in modern Metroidvanias, these upgrades were one-time use, so they didn't necessarily serve the same purpose as those in its contemporaries. The next Protovania I'll be talking about is Brainbreaker. Brainbreaker was released in 1985 for the Sharp X1, published by Enix.
その下には誰かいるんですか？ドラゴンクエスト8と関係ないことなので答えられません。じゃあ稲垣さん、恋愛の方はどうなんですか？関係ないでしょ、それも。
Yes, that Enix, and developed by Hiroshi Ishikawa, who coincidentally was also in high school at the time. You play as a suspiciously familiar power suit-wearing explorer marooned on a seemingly abandoned alien planet, which definitely sounds familiar to me. Brainbreaker was a side-scrolling platformer that utilized utility-based exploration in the form of various upgrades. Right out the gate, it established itself with a distinct Metroidvania taste by requiring you to find a gun before properly exploring a nearby abandoned city. In addition to the gun, there were other upgrades like ID cards and a jetpack that added movement ability. What Brainbreaker lacked from our definition, though, was the notion of true non-linearity. All the objectives were required in Brainbreaker, so the only real form of exploration was backtracking. Next up, there's Citadel. Citadel was developed by Michael Jacobson and published by European companies Superior Software for the BBC Micro and Acorn Electron computers. Like the others, Citadel was a side-scrolling platformer, but this time it had more of a focus on true non-linearity. It was also pretty advanced for its release. It featured synthesized speech and environmental sounds for things like splashing water, which was more of a novelty back then than now. Interestingly, Citadel recently had its source reverse engineered, meaning that this almost 40-year-old game still has a modding scene for it. There are a couple other Protovanias like Xanadu, Dragon Slayer 2, in addition to games that were released between Castlevania and Metroid in 1986, like Super Pitfall and Milan's Secret Castle, which released in September and November of that year, respectively. What's important to note is that Protovanias aren't really Metroidvanias in the sense of our definition. Instead, they're things that came beforehand, kind of marking an era before the proper arrival of Releasing in August of 1986 for the Family Computer Disk System, Metroid was developed primarily by Yoshio Sakamoto, along with help from Hirokazu Tanaka and Makoto Kano, and the rest of his team at Nintendo R&D1. Originally under the name Space Hunters, Metroid was the follow-up and intentional departure from Sakamoto's previous game and directorial debut, Gumshoe. Sakamoto reportedly wanted to make something darker and more mature as compared to his previous titles. This was reflected in Metroid's Ridley Scott Alien-inspired story. In the far-off year of 20X5, a research facility is attacked by the dreaded space pirates, who have now seized samples of the Metroid, a parasitic alien discovered on the planet SR-388. The space pirates intend to use these life forms as bioweapons that will bend the galaxy to their knees. Samus, the greatest of all bounty hunters, is hired to infiltrate the space pirates' base on the planet Zebes, stop the space pirates, and destroy the Metroids. It's a setup that everyone has heard 1,000 times at this point. Metroid was a massive success both commercially and critically upon release, and launched the now gargantuan franchise. Metroid's gameplay was unique among its peers at the time. Sure, Protovanias all exhibited qualities of Metroidvanias in one way or another, but Metroid was the first to seamlessly integrate all these qualities into a cohesive experience. Many of the power-ups like crawling into Morph Ball, Jump Boots, Ice Beam, and Screw Attack were immediate icons that would become synonymous with the franchise from then on. The Metroid franchise would then be put on the back burner until 1991 with the Game Boy exclusive sequel, Metroid 2, and a proper home console were released 10 years later in '94. Super Metroid marked a seminal moment in the genre, and in the franchise. While Metroid 2 was handled by directors Hiroji Kiritaka and Hiroyuki Kimura, Sakamoto returned to the franchise with its arrival on the Super Nintendo. Taking advantage of the new hardware, Super Metroid brought several innovations to the series' mechanics, one of these being the introduction of a tile-based map that filled out as you explored, a mechanic that would become a staple in most Metroidvanias released to this day. Super Metroid saw Samus return to the planet Zebes, chasing the space pirate Ridley, who had stolen the last remaining Metroid. Treading familiar ground, yet bucking expectations left and right, Super Metroid was an immediate hit, and is still heralded as one of the greatest games of all time. Unfortunately, Super Metroid would mark the last 2D home console Metroid to be released to this date. The series once again fell into limbo until 2002, with the release of Metroid Fusion on the Game Boy Advance. Fusion was later followed up with Zero Mission in 2004, also on the Game Boy Advance. These would mark the last 2D Metroids to be released until a full 13 years later. The franchise would carry on outside of its 2D roots with the Prime trilogy and several spin-offs like Metroid Prime Pinball, but largely these would not greatly innovate on the Metroidvania formula. Unlike releasing just 2 months after the original Metroid, Castlevania and its near-identical MSX2 port, Vampire Killer, was a 2D side-scrolling platformer game themed heavily around classic monsters and horror mythology. Developed and published by Konami.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Easy. Easy. Whoa! 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 Whoa!
Yes, that Konami. And directed by Hitoshi Akamatsu, Castlevania was known for its difficulty and many secrets. You played as the heroic Simon Belmont, a man out to kill the dreaded vampire Dracula. It received modest success at the time of its release, seeing a port to the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987. Upon release, work went directly into an immediate sequel, Castlevania II: Simon's Quest. And it was Simon's Quest. Simon's Quest was a massive departure from its predecessor. Still being a 2D side-scroller, and still being frustratingly hard, Simon's Quest introduced RPG elements into the franchise. Among its additions was the introduction of towns with NPCs that Simon could interact with. Though this was by no means a new mechanic in video games at the time, it was something that, much like the map in Super Metroid, would become a staple in Metroidvanias as a genre. Unlike Metroid though, Konami didn't stop for 8 years after their second game. Haunted Castle, Castlevania 3, Castlevania 2 for the Game Boy this time, and Super Castlevania 4 all released year after year. Castlevania quickly made a name for itself in the platforming space with this rapid release schedule, iterating on the first game lightly with every new title. The classic Castlevanias would see their final installment for quite a while with the Japan-only Castlevania Rondo of Blood, and its kind of North American release Dracula X. These classic Vanias were quickly wearing thin on the general populace, until something, and someone, really special entered the fray in 1997. Originally slated to be released on the Sega 32X, Symphony of the Night was released in March of '97 for the PlayStation, and later the Sega Saturn. Produced and partly directed by Rondo of Blood's director, Toru Hagihara, Symphony of the Night is better known as the child of Koji Igarashi, brought in to direct following Hagihara's promotion to his respective division. A brief tangent on Igarashi first. Igarashi to this point had worked on as a programmer at Konami for about 4 years. Symphony of the Night was technically his second Castlevania game, as he appeared in Hagihara's Rondo of Blood as a special thanks credit. Symphony of the Night was his directorial debut, and boy, did he make an impression. Taking notes from Simon's Quest of all games, Symphony of the Night reintroduced RPG mechanics into the franchise. Igarashi felt that platforming and combat found in classic Vanias was too challenging for casual players, opting instead for an experience system that allowed them to increase in power as the game progressed. In addition to this, Symphony of the Night introduced an array of armors and different weapons to use. Notably, Symphony of the Night departed from classic Vanias in its non-linearity. Resembling Super Metroid, the player would explore Dracula's castle, unlocking a variety of movement abilities to progress into new areas, filling out the map as they did so. Due to a growing shift toward 3D, Symphony of the Night was not the commercial success that Super Metroid was, despite similar critical acclaim. Igarashi would take a brief break from the Castlevania franchise with 2000's Elder Gate, returning in 2001 with Circle of the Moon on the Game Boy Advance. This began the era of the EGAVANIA, and thus the classification of Metroidvanias as a genre. EGAVANIAs being the run of portable Castlevanias featuring heavy input from Igarashi, ending with Castlevania Order of Ecclesia on the Nintendo DS in 2008. Where Metroid was silent, EGAVANIAs were going strong with nearly yearly releases, all with great critical reception. All good things had to come to an end though. Koji Igarashi ceased working on Castlevania games for the most part after the botched development of a 2D home console Castlevania game in 2008, departing Konami in 2014, leaving at a time where Metroidvanias could not have been more popular. Metroidvanias have pretty much always been around in some form or another, but for the purpose of this video, we'll be talking about modern, independently developed games directly inspired by the Metroidvania formula. Or, if you want to be pretentious, you could call these NEOVANIAs. NEOVANIAs aren't necessarily a genre in and of themselves, but rather an era in the greater history of Metroidvania as a whole. I'd argue that NEOVANIAs began hitting the scene sometime in 2004 with Cave Story and La Mulana, though there are probably some earlier examples you could find. These games were rather simplistic interpretations of the Metroidvania definition. However, they received pretty universal acclaim upon their release, to the point that Cave Story has gone from a freeware PC game to a game with several ports on almost every modern system, and La Mulana has received a sequel 15 years later. La Mulana and Cave Story triggered a snowball effect, leading to more and more indie Metroidvanias being released year after year, coinciding with the indie explosion in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Many of these developers of early NeoVanias would grow to great success online, like Aquaria developer Derek Yu. NeoVanias would stay relatively obscure until the late 2010s, with the major success of a couple standout titles. Ori and the Blind Forest, Axiom Verge, Guacamelee, and of course Hollow Knight all released in the latter half of the 2010s, and began to reintroduce the mainstream to Metroidvanias. Becoming the new temple titles in the genre, they would not just new takes on the genre, both in gameplay and theming, but were, perhaps more importantly, really, really good. Couple this with their success outside the PC indie environment, they all became immediate successes. There were of course other similar yet more obscure NeoVanias, and they had their fans as well, but when I think of NeoVanias, I think of these four games, first and foremost of having the biggest impact. Until Metroid and Castlevania came back with a vengeance, of course. Not to be displaced, almost like their back-to-back releases in the 80s, Metroidvania and Castlevania hit the scene once more. Starting with Metroid, the franchise would see the same game released twice in the span of about a year, one being kind of okay, the other one being one of the best in the franchise. AM2R, or another Metroid 2 remake, is a faithful remake of Metroid 2 in the style of Zero Mission. Developed over 10 plus years by the absolute madman Milton Gosti, and released in late 2016, AM2R was a huge love letter to 2D Metroid, which was then forgotten by Nintendo. Nintendo would then issue a takedown of the game shortly after its release, and unfortunately there was absolutely no way to play AM2R. It is entirely lost to time. The very next year, Castlevania had a fan game released as well. Castlevania The Lacard Chronicles 2 was developed by Megami Games and followed the Igavania formula to a T. Featuring a fantastic soundtrack and reuniting voice actors from previous Castlevania games, Lacard Chronicles was well received all around. And finally, in 2019, Metroidvania superstar and my boyfriend Koji Igarashi returned triumphantly to the genre with Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, taking heavy notes from his previous games, Symphony of the Night and Aria of Sorrow. Bloodstained was similarly critically acclaimed and was the game that inspired me to make this video. And that takes us to today. Metroidvanias are an insanely deep genre, and I implore you to check them out if you haven't yet. It'd be nearly impossible for me to go through every single great release in the genre, because there are just too many. And there are more and more being released every single week. And that's not even mentioning those that were released on legacy systems. I didn't even mention Shantae in this video, and I love Shantae. If you're looking to break into the genre, here's a brief flowchart. It doesn't feature all the games in this video, but it'll set you on the right path at the very least. In the description there'll be a couple more resources, including a spreadsheet featuring featuring almost 500 games from Metroidvanias.com. If that's not enough for you, go figure it out yourself. Along with that, there will be a couple of academic articles about Metroidvania design that you should read if you're at all interested in them. I hope this has been at least a good introduction to the genre if you're not familiar with it. Feel free to subscribe if you like my content, and write in the comments if you enjoyed the video.